Welcome to the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding Marxian theory, its philosophy, its politics, and its economics. I'm your host, Shahram Azhar, Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University, and I'm joined by Professor Richard Wolff. Okay, let's go. Thank you all for joining us, and welcome to the Dialectic at Work, a series of dialogues, beginning with this one being our first episode on Marxian theory, its philosophy, its politics, and its economics. I am your host, Shahram Azhar. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania, where I teach courses in Marxian economics, obviously, and economic development. And with me is a man who needs absolutely no introduction at all. Nevertheless, I'm going to embarrass myself with one. Professor Rick Wolff, who's by leaps and bounds, America's and perhaps the world's most famous Marxist theorist. He's inspired, like myself, thousands of activists, intellectuals all across the globe. And I also want to thank the organizers of the Historical Materialism Conference for organizing this amazing event. I also want to thank the organizers of the Institute of Radical Imagination, the Left Forum, as well as Democracy at Work for televising this event and taking our message via the internet to hundreds of thousands of people across the globe. So thank you very much for organizing such an amazing event, guys. Because I was having a conversation with some people before this panel, and one of the great things about a conference like this, unlike other academic conferences, is that you get to meet people from a host of academic disciplines. And one of the things that kind of came out of those discussions that we were having, we were all approaching the question from different vantage points, different fields, different disciplines, etc. But one of those things that I thought would be interesting, which is going to be our central concern for today's episode, was this acute sense of awareness that we're living through times which are inducing enormous fear, anxiety. That's hardly surprising that we live through what some have described as a crisis of everything, or in academic circles, because we like these fancy words, a polycrisis. But we quite literally mean a crisis of the entire bourgeois social order and mode of existence as it is. Just think about it, guys. On the one hand, it's a crisis of democracy, a crisis of the right to life, liberty, and free speech. There are students in the audience who, for the crime of expressing their right to free speech and protest, have been victims of extreme forms of brutality in their institutions of higher learning, in their academic institutions. I want to acknowledge those students and their struggle as we speak. But it's not just something that's happening in the US. Just follow the Indian elections. From Argentina to India, we're witnessing the rise of far-right authoritarian dictatorial forces which are corroding the spirit of democracy, not just in the US, but everywhere. That's not the only problem, is it? On the other hand, there's a deafening, if not delusional silence about the ecological catastrophe that waits us. I grew up in Pakistan, a country that contributes next to nothing to the carbon footprint. Yet, year after year after year, we're experiencing heat waves, floods, a catastrophe that's destroying people's lives, livelihoods, their bonds, their social relationships, you name it. So I want to acknowledge and salute the climate activists in the audience who see the geological science and the imminent catastrophe that awaits us, all because of capitalism. This imminent catastrophe. And I want to acknowledge these climate scientists who see what they see. They know the science, and they want to urge their fellow sapiens to feel as they feel. And they live with the misery of Galileo, who saw that the earth revolves around the sun before everyone else did. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that no matter how you look at the problem, at whatever scale, the planetary scale, the scale of individual countries, the scale of the entire species, or indeed at the level of the individual self, where you see suicides like never before, rage, anxiety, broken selves, broken relationships. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that if anyone is still in doubt that we're living through a crisis of everything, a crisis of the entire social order, you need only wake up and look as far as a mirror and ask yourself the following question: is it time to break that silence? Well, with the dialectic at work and the series of episodes that we're going to be launching, beginning with this episode today, we've decided, and it's a firm commitment, and I invite all of you to follow our work because this is going to be a series of episodes beginning with this one today. I invite you guys to engage in this conversation with us because we've decided to destroy that silence. We've decided to talk. We've decided that we're going to have conversations in the spirit of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. We've made a decision that we're going to have polemics in the spirit of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. And we're going to go back to work. The dialectic, this method of revolutionary consciousness and change that goes back thousands of years, has to go back to work once again, because in that spirit, once we recognize that we want to go back to work and discover and reinterpret and reconstruct Marxian theory on a basis that is useful and applicable for our present times, we're going to turn to the greatest, in our view, accumulated repository of critical thinking about capitalism, i.e. Marxism. And we're going to mine it for the way forward. And I want to emphasize that verb, mining, because as you will see, we're in agreement with Lukács, who described the dialectic, the Marxian dialectic, not as a scholastic, abstract kind of thing, but a revolutionary dialectic that not only understands what's going on, but also, more importantly, seeks to change it and transcend capitalism as a dismal, destructive mode of producing economic life. So with that context for what we're about to do, what the project is going to look like, I wanted to just briefly mention how it's going to be organized. I'm going to start by asking Professor Wolff some interesting questions about the dialectic and how it can be used to make sense of what's happening around us. And hopefully at the end, we're going to have some time for questions and answers with the audience. Sounds like a plan, guys? All right. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Professor Wolff a rather provocative question. Because some people, including some on the left, argue that discussions of method or the dialectical method or those kinds of conversations are purely scholastic and philosophical questions. I was reading your book, Knowledge in Class, this amazing seminal contribution to Marxism, and you don't seem to have ever agreed with that notion that discussions of method are archaic, boring, irrelevant, or settled. Why is that?
Okay, well, thank you very much for your generous introduction. I will try to live up to what it was that you said. I'm often introduced, which is very flattering, by a quotation from the New York Times, which referred to me as the foremost Marxist economist in the United States. And I have to be honest with you by telling you, number one, that's a low bar by which to be judged, since there aren't very many of us. And it's even worse because the New York Times wouldn't have a clue about what that means anyway. And since I know personally the reporter who wrote that, he didn't understand anything about it either. So there we are. I agree that theory is crucial. For those of you who know what I've done in my life, and particularly the last dozen years when I've tried to go public rather than do what I did in the university most of my life, do it in what the internet now makes possible, which is literally a global audience. If you've liked it, if you thought it was useful, then I have to tell you that this is a product of my using Marxist theory. It really isn't me. I'd love you to think it was all me, but it isn't. Very little of this is me. I add a little something the way everybody who uses any tool adds something to it. But it's the tool that's the crucial thing, and that's the Marxian theory. And so for me, of course, I have to pay attention to it because I understand how central it was to everything I've tried to do and to every success that I've been able to achieve, both myself and I unfortunately don't have Steve Resnick with me anymore, but he deserves every bit as much credit for all of this as I do. Our work really was, we were best friends, on a personal level as well as colleagues. And it was an invaluable collective project that we engaged in until he had the bad taste to get cancer and die. We did a lot of things together, but I was unwilling to go on that trip with him. He had to do that by himself. And I regret it. It's been 11 years now since this happened. And so the last decade or so, I've done it on my own. But I miss very much the collaboration that made all that possible. And as a footnote, I think it's more than a detail. The Marxian approach is dialectical, and that's a word very close from the original Greek of dialogue, back and forth. And it goes better if you have more people. It's not done well alone. It's done much better. Steve and I in our economics department up at UMass were unique, not just in the Marxian theory we did, but there's a faculty, I believe numbers now about 27, 28 people. We were the only ones who decided to move. Each professor gets an office with a desk. We moved one of our desks into the other office of the other one. So there were two desks in that office, and the other room, a corner room, about which professors normally seriously consider murdering their colleagues. The other office became a student lounge. In other words, we collectivized the office space. Nobody else did that. That too was a part of our Marxism. A famous writer once wrote, "We don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are." It was a brilliant artist's way of capturing that the process of knowing anything always involves the application of a theory. Another way to get at this is a kind of marvel I had all my life in academic America here, since I only went to universities here, that I had course after course in which we were told, even by the title of the course, this is a course in the theory of economics, or the theory of macroeconomics, or the theory of economic development, or whatever. And yet, the amount of time spent on the word theory in the course was zero. Everybody proceeded to do the theoretical work as if we all know and all agree on what theory is, which is really remarkable in a university when you can take a walk down the hall to the philosophy department, take you 5 minutes, and there you will discover that for thousands of years, right up until the present, we don't agree about what theory is, and that there are whole courses devoted to the different ways people think about the world, courses devoted to the different concepts of what truth is. And yet, go back down the hall to the economics department, no discussion, no awareness of this at all. We are all doing this thing called theory, as if it were uncomplicated, everybody knew it, and we were together in this unified effort. It's childish. It's a commentary on the university that tells you one of the horrible consequences of separating the disciplines, political science, economics, history, is that nobody understands the enormous relevance to whatever one you're in of what's going on in all the others, which is not a way of helping to develop knowledge, which is the excuse for it. It's the opposite. It squelches knowledge. It narrows knowledge. It allows people to say the grossest nonsense in economics because they're not troubled by the 400 history examples that would make a joke out of what you just said. It's really extraordinary. Especially because the theories are very different. It won't take you very long. Marx is famous and unique among economists. There aren't maybe 3 or 4 others like him. He spent an enormous amount of his intellectual energy studying the other kinds of theory in the field before he undertook his own project. I used to teach a course in the Marxian theory and the different ways people have understood that. And I used something called the theories of surplus value, which is basically a 3-volume set, not to be confused with Das Kapital, which is the more famous of his 3-volume sets. This was just his notebooks compiled together by others, not by him. But the notebooks are all about other theorists. And what was it about the way they went about it? There you can read long, very respectful discussions of Adam Smith by Karl Marx, or of David Ricardo by Karl Marx, or of dozens of others, well-known, not so well-known. And you see Marx working out what his theory, an approach to economics, will be, different from what they were. What he would take from them, but would deny other parts of them, and then reinterpret and reconstruct even those parts he took. And he spells it out there. So you get a lot of help about how you can distinguish Marxian theory from other theories. Very, very few of the luminaries in conventional economics ever repaid this respect to Marx, and none of them do it today. Remarkable. Really remarkable. You may have excused it in the early of the 20th century when Marxism wasn't a global phenomenon. But in the last 150 years since Marx died, Marxism has spread to every country on earth. It's alive and well everywhere. In universities, out of them. In political parties, out of them. In government, out of it. It's everywhere. The United States is one of the few places in the world which works so hard at pretending what I just said isn't the case. Most other places in the world have given up that project. Too hard to sustain. But we're a hardy lot here in the United States. We'll hold on to beliefs everybody else has long ago discarded. So let me say the same thing in a slightly different way. If you don't question what theory is, if you don't explore how theories can be different, you will imagine, wrongly, that theory is a scholastic exercise you don't have to bother with, that theory is a straightforward matter, that theory is, to coin a phrase that Lukács was concerned with, common sense. It's just, of course, theory, you ask a question and you look at something to see how it works. And so we all do that. It's like eating a meal or taking a nap. It's just, who needs to investigate it? It's sort of straightforward. If you do that, I'm here to tell you, you're already lost for the Marxian program. Because what you're accepting is the particular theory that's dominant, as if it were the only one. And that's the death of any revolutionary possibility. Then you're captured by the status quo. You haven't questioned. I would argue that you can get to Marxism that way. What you'll get is a concept of Marxism created by the use of a theory which I would argue is an enemy of Marxism. And you'll come up with a pretty bizarre notion of what Marxism is. Not because you aren't smart, and not because you aren't careful, but because you accepted without questioning the common sense theory of how you go about it. In economics, I'll give you the example. It's imagining that the way you do economics is you study alternative models. Economists like that. They're snatching something from the natural sciences, and then they feel much better and bigger if they do that. So you have the neoclassical model. Those of you who do economics, you know these words. And you have the Keynesian model. And maybe you have the Austrian model. And then you have the Marxian model. And then you set it up that way. But that's not, for me, that's not what I understand Marxism to be. Marxism is a different way of thinking. Doesn't make use of the models or making a list of 4 models or 6 models, whatever it is. It doesn't do that. And you don't have to agree with me, but I'm opening this space that now you have to be a little worried. Could you be using a theory to grasp Marxism that is not the appropriate thing? It's like thinking you're going to build a house by knocking the pieces of wood together, and the tool you're going to use is a marshmallow. Maybe if you hit the nail hard enough, often enough, with the marshmallow, as it loses its moisture and becomes hard, you could eventually have some sort of structure. You could. But it'll look real funny. It won't be the outcome that I get if I'm using a hammer and nails and other ways of going about it. Oh, now, last part of this. Marx was a student of Hegel. We may be talking a little bit about Hegel later on in our conversation. But one of the great things that Marx took, as so many in his generation did, and indeed many since that generation have also done, and as a footnote, although we can talk about it later, Hegel is almost as buried under the rug of American intellectual life as Marx is, even though he wasn't a revolutionary in the sense Marx was. But Marx was very respectful of his teacher, critical in some ways, but very respectful of Hegel. And one of the great things Hegel did was to develop a critical notion of what theory is. It's one of the great champions of formulating that we think about the world in radically different ways. And that made Marx and his generation very aware of what some people call epistemology, the study of what thinking is. What do people do when they think? There's no agreement on this. There hasn't been for thousands of years. Hegel was one of those who took us back to the ancient Greeks to show us how way back then they understood that we don't agree on what thinking is about anything, let alone economics. We disagree. Some people think that the process of thinking involves looking at the world, taking in the factual material through your five senses. You know, you can see it or hear it or taste it or smell it or touch it, those five. We take in all this information, and then we make a thought about it, and we see whether the thought we make about it is or isn't confirmed by those factual things we took in with our senses. Some people think that that's what thought is. End of conversation. Who needs to ask a question about that? But you can only be that blind and that slow if no one has ever introduced you to epistemology. Because it's childish once you do this. For example, I'll stay with my example. I don't mean to foreclose later things we're going to talk about. But it doesn't matter. Let me go back over it. Okay, here we'll do it. What do the senses take in? Your eyes, you know, I assume most of you know, your eyes, light comes into your eyes, the retina receives what? Millions of pieces of information. To look around this room, there are an infinity of dots in this room. They're all reflecting light, goes right into your brain. Those are the facts, what you see. But here's the problem. They're in the billions, these facts. And your brain can't handle billions. So what's going to happen? It can all go black. That happens to some people. It can all go white. That happens to some people. But most of us, our eyes operate as filters. They are not neutral. They can't be. Your brain can't handle everything coming into your eyes, or your ears, or your fingertips, or anything else. Your brain selects what registers as, I saw the little puppy on the sidewalk. Good. You actually saw millions of other things. There's an experiment teachers who understand this give to their young children. If you were lucky, you had this when you were in elementary school. The teacher hands each little child a piece of paper and a crayon. And I want you to write down what you see at the front of the room. 30 little children take 5 minutes and write what they see. No two children write the same thing. What happened here? The answer is, you're seeing millions of things. You can't answer the question. I see, because you would die of old age before you finished the list of all the things you can see. Nobody does it. Everybody has already been trained to go with the filter that their brain operates. That filter is your theory. Your theory is focusing your eyes and your brain on the puppy's tail, or the puppy's nose, or the puppy's doo-doo, or whatever it is that attracts you. And if you're a psychologist, you wonder, And you take a lot of information about a person by asking yourself, why did they look? They saw this is what they talked about. This is what the child wrote down. My wife's a psychotherapist. When she deals with young children, she does this. She gets enormous information about a child who decides to draw a doggy rather than a tree, or to draw the tree this way. Right? It's a method used by child psychologists all over the world for this reason. We have different theories. Marx put it this way: our senses themselves have become theorists. Because you can't, the notion that your senses are neutral, that they take in whatever is out there, you can't do that anymore. Once you understand that that's not possible. Nobody can do that. Nobody ever has done that. Everybody works with a theory about, whether they're conscious of it or not, that's another matter. But they're all focused on something. Why did you see the puppy? Why did you see the tree? Why did you see the sun in the sky? Well, the answer is it's your biography that answers that question. Who are you? Where'd you come from? What was your mother like? How did you have this experience? What does dog mean to you? These are all complicated. Well, we could use a term. We'd come up with a term. Steve and I struggled with this. How do you get at this? How do you do that? Here goes. What determines how your senses work? Same question. How do you understand why you have a theory the way you do? Why do you look at these things and not that? We have struggles in the streets now where some people see what happened in Gaza on the 7th of October, and they don't see much else. And then we have other people who see everything that happened since the 7th and don't care all that much about what happened on the 7th. Is it a matter of what we see? No. It's a matter of how we see and how aware we are of what it is we see and what sense to make of it. So theory is crucial to everything that happens in the world. People explain what they do by reference to how they make sense of the world, and that depends on their theory. Physicists have understood this for a long time. It's known as the Heisenberg principle. It's the discovery by physicists that when they look through a telescope at the heavens, what they see out there is dependent on the telescope. How the glass was ground affects what you see. So don't say, I know what it is that's out there. You don't. Because what's out there depends on the theory used to construct the telescope through which your eyes are selecting what that's coming through there they're going to register. This is theory squared, theory multiplied. Heisenberg understood we can't assume that having seen the particle go through the ether, that's what happened. No. That could be a function of the telescope, a function of the microscope, a function of any one of the tools that human beings using theory constructed. You'll never know. You don't know whether the things that have changed in the world are changes in the world or changes in the way the world was understood. Punchline. If you do Marxism, if you study the Marxian tradition, and I want to underscore what Shahram said, I found my way to Marxian theory against the university in which I I grew up. And because my parents were immigrants here in the United States, and the particular history of my family, I was under enormous pressure to make up to my parents, mother and father, the fact that their lives were basically shattered by being forced out of their country to come to the United States, which they didn't want, to speak English, which they didn't know, and to make a living without any money. Like most immigrants, not a good recipe. They were grateful because it saved their lives, but beyond that, So my father had been a lawyer, so his legal career was over in Germany. My mother had been a college student, so that was never finished. So I had to make it. And I had to make it not just for me, but for them. So under a lot of pressure, I went to the so-called best schools because they thought that would be a way out. You know, like some people become a great athlete because it's a way out, or a great actress, or whatever it is, something to get out of the poverty and the trouble that you had. So for me, it was going to Harvard, and then to Stanford, and then to Yale. 10 years of my life spent in those institutions, where everything was done by pretty smart people to persuade me to be a booster child for capitalism. My first semester, we had a seminar, and it was a seminar on American foreign policy. And our teacher was a professor in the political science department at Harvard at that time, named Henry Kissinger. So he was a good exponent of this sort of thinking. I had to run from the end of class to the library, which I did almost every day, to try desperately to find support for my view that my teachers, in terms of what they said about politics, were wrong. And I found my way to Marxism because, as Shahram said, it's the best and biggest and most developed repository of anti-capitalist thinking the world has so far created. Maybe in the future we'll see other traditions, but right now they take the cake. So if you're going to study anti-capitalism in any kind of sense, the Marxian tradition is where you got to go. Maybe you'll get beyond it, but you'll only get beyond it by going through it. Those people who think they can leap over that, good luck to you. At best, you will reinvent the Marxist wheel, and that's not worth it. That's been done for you. Build on that, and that's what we need. With that mentality, I also discovered that theory are different. And I understood that for Marx, the revolution requires that you don't just stop at the economics or the politics. You have to go to what is misnamed philosophy or epistemology. You have to be revolutionary in your thinking about theory. But there again, we have giants to help us, like Hegel and Marx and others. And I think if you do that, here's what you'll be rewarded with. You'll be troubled, but you'll discover that there are as many Marxisms as there are theoretical ways to get at Marxism. But then again, that's true of Christianity or Islam or anything else. Look at, the minute you get involved, you'll see that people have made very different senses of the Quran or of the Bible or any of these other great works of people trying to make sense of the world. And Marxism is no different in that regard. And there are revolutionary ways of thinking about it, and maybe we'll go into that. And I think you'll come up with a very different kind of Marxism. When I got frustrated at UMass with students who came to study Marxism and were in our classes where we taught that, I got really upset when the students, after a semester where I thought I had gotten across what I had to teach, told me that Marxism was a model like this, and it was different from the Keynesian model, and it was different from the neoclassical. And I go, oh my God. They thought theory was a straightforward. They were importing the theory that is embedded in the neoclassical convention, used it to try to understand, honestly, try to understand Marxism, and came up with a marshmallow for building a house. And it's a house. It's the view of Marxism that, I'll try not to be mean here, that Paul Krugman has. I've debated with him, so I'm aware of what he thinks Marxism is. For me, a caricature. But for him, it's his. And even at UMass, I would fight with some of my colleagues who in those days referred to themselves as Marxists. But their conception was completely different from mine. Because I went about it with this notion of a revolutionary theory. So you can ignore theory, you can dismiss it, it's a scholastic, navel gazing, or some other clever phrase to push it off. But don't be fooled. Whatever the phrase used, shutting down the debate over epistemology is a none too subtle way to draw you into ways of doing theory that are not friendly to at least my way of understanding Marxism. Mm-hmm. And you and I may come to real struggles with one another because we have a different concept of theory. And I come back to what I said at the beginning. If what I do, whether you get it out of the books we've written or the television show we produce every week and all that, if you find that interesting and useful, it's because of the Marxism, but it's also because of the particular theory that I got from Marx and from others who were concerned about this question of theory and its relationship to Marx. And that includes Mr. Lukács, the Hungarian giant. It includes Antonio Gramsci, for those of you who know something about the Marxist canon. More recently, it includes Luis Althusser, someone I studied with personally on my own, and others. I mean, in his own way, Jacques Derrida. Parts of that postmodernism are ways of getting at this. Other parts aren't, but I would urge you to take it seriously. Don't brush away. We do not agree on what theory is or how you go about it or what it means to say something is true. How do you know it's true? Those are the questions of epistemology.